Good afternoon and welcome to today's APBP webinar, Information and Education on the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, MUTCD. I'm Melanie Bowser, APBP Executive Director, and we're very pleased to have each of you with us. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. All attendees on the webinar are automatically muted. We likely won't have time for a formal Q&A today, so if you have a question throughout the webinar, please submit it into the chat module in your GoToWebinar control panel, and our presenters will make an effort to keep tabs on the questions and field them in chat as we go along. If you have any technical issues during the presentation, please contact the number that you see on the screen now for assistance. As a reminder, today's presentation is the first of a two-part series APBP is offering on the MUTCD. As a follow-up, we'll be holding a facilitated forum using Zoom 2 weeks from today on Wednesday, March 24th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our presenters. Peter Kuntz of Portland, Oregon, serves as one of APBP's liaisons to the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, or NCUTCD. Tom Bertulis is with KTUA Planning and Landscape Architecture and is another APBP liaison to the NCUTCD. Matthew Rowe is Technical Lead at the National Association of City Transportation Officials, NACTO, and Wen Dang, who also serves as an NCUTCD representative. And with those brief introductions, I'm going to turn things over to Peter to get us started.
Great, thanks, Melanie. Happy to be here today, and with this good group of speakers. It's really an honor to be able to talk to you all today and to share some of the work that we've been doing. Just want to check that you can see my slides. Are coming across okay? Great. So the idea here is that we're going to provide a little bit of background on what's happening with the MUTCD NPA. I think the part of the puzzle here is that often this NPA process has been a little mysterious. So we're hoping to really open this up to APBP members and give you a sense for what we think your role should be. So if you think about the NPA, you can think about a lot of different things, and the MUTCD is part of a document that describes what we can and can't do with traffic control devices. So this is one of my favorite examples of a traffic control device, and you can't do this. You're not supposed to add a shark to the screen, to the sign, right? But that's sometimes how it feels like when you walk into a traffic engineer's office. You're on your bike and you're trying to just ride along, and all of a sudden you end up hitting a streetcar track. So that we would try to demystify this process. So the MUTCD is the basic principles that traffic engineers use to identify what elements we're going to add to the intersections and to the roadways that we work on. The reason the MUTCD is important is it's because we did have a lack of uniformity historically. The idea of where the MUTCD is organized in 9 different chapters. You'll note that bicycle chapter is the 9th chapter, and that this new content introduces autonomous vehicles in chapter 5, something that we didn't have before. So this is new content that we are part of the process now is to comment on this new information and to make sure that the FHWA gets it right. FHWA ultimately is the publisher of this. And so as a national committee member, I guess Tom, Yen, and I are all suggesting things that would ultimately get changes to be made, and you can too, and Tom will go into that in much more detail. The lack of uniformity comes from the way back in the history, and this notion of a stop sign. And I think we can all agree that we want someone that sees a stop sign to be able to know what that means right away. And so if you think about, it's not just for English speakers, generally that symbol is known in more than just the US. And so that's a traffic control device that's it's easy to understand what that means. And this slide comes from Gene Hawkins, who's the chair of the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. So the history, of course, back in the 50s was uniformity, and that has come through to today. And so that's what we're talking about with this 11th edition, is how much of this has to be uniform. What elements do we need to have that are instantly recognizable by the traveling public? And so that's largely due to a safety perspective. If you think about it, driving at 55 miles an hour on a freeway, you want traffic control markings that are very clear. But then once you get off that highway environment and you think about the various users and the uniformity of those users, I argue that our users are not uniform. You know, if I think about my daughter on the right and Dong Ho Chang on the left, that's a big difference between the level of understanding of what the traffic control devices mean out there. And so we have to think about that. So when we talk with engineers about what they're doing with respect to uniformity, one of my points is that I like to make is that we're not all uniform. Our users have distinct challenges that they all come to the table with. So that being said, we'll get into a little bit of who is the National Committee. So the NCUTCD, it's comprised of members of sponsoring agencies. So APBP is one of those sponsoring agencies. I'll give you a little sense of the voting and how that happens. We strive as a committee, we strive for a 50-50 split of public and private. So if you look at our examples, I'm the public sector member, Tom is the private sector member. So we gather pre-pandemic, we gather in conference rooms. I guess the question is, will we ever do that again? I think we will someday. But we'll gather in conference rooms and debate these topics to try to figure out how do we develop traffic control devices that make sense. And so there's amendments and suggestions that happen. And then, of course, ultimately, we are an advisory role. We advise the Federal Highway Administration on what would be good additions or changes that would make for a better application of traffic engineering standards that can be used across the country. So who are those members? So I like to say I put on my best Nancy Pelosi imitation and count votes often to figure out where we are and whether we can get some things passed. And so AASHTO, ITE, the Institute of Transportation Engineers, they have 8 votes. APBP has just a single vote. And so that's, you know, where we are a bit in the minority in terms of the multimodal aspects. NACTO just recently joined, so we have allies there in the Bike League. Rock Miller is the voting member from the League of American Bicyclists. So we have to think about how we work amongst those different organizations and the particular people that are involved in the discussions that go into making recommendations within the manual. The notion of task forces are also there. So I mentioned the 9 chapters. The task forces are also instrumental in making changes to the manual. So autonomous vehicles is a task force that's been going on for a couple of years. There's a task force on research, pedestrians, and then bike signals as a temporary task force that's still trying to sort out that issue that Peter Firth mentioned in the APBP listserv. And I think, or I guess the community, I guess I should say, that dates me that I'm going back to the listserv. The APBP community is obviously a tool that we're using to look at where we get comments, what things should be addressed, and how do we all move forward. So you think about the Bicycle Technical Committee, and I took this list from 2014. I remember thinking about who is on it, who's representative on it, and I guess I'll just take a moment to remember John LaPlante, who certainly we miss as a member of this committee. But that committee is really made up of individuals that are really trying to find ways in which to change practice and make recommendations. So for me, I've been working on a couple of different things that actually Tom will highlight a little bit later on. But again, back to the manual and what we deal with, we're writing documentation, we're writing standards. And so there's three main terms that Matthew and others will talk about here is shall, should, and may. Shall indicates a mandatory condition, it's a requirement, absolute requirement, and engineers don't like to deviate from that. Should's a recommendation, so you can deviate, it's possible to deviate, but sometimes engineers don't like to deviate from that because that's usually considered a best practice. And then may is a permissive condition, and that's no requirement intended. So that's the basic makeup of the language. So be careful of your language, engineers. I think this is the one area where engineers actually care about the language and are cautious with how they use these three words. There's some interesting work out there, and the University of Delaware put out a little blog post saying, well, is this just a guideline? And acknowledging that the MUTCD is imperfect, which as APBP members, I think we would agree it is imperfect. It's clearly not a safe systems approach. There are a lot of issues. If I look at the APBP policy documents, that the MUTCD conflicts with us. But it is a consistent and faithful application. And I put this in quotes, create a safer environment for pedestrians, cyclists, and drivers. I'd say more on the driver's side than pedestrian cyclists, but one could argue in the age of Vision Zero that we're not even doing that very well. And we'll talk about speed limits later in this topic, in this webinar. The reason that we do often follow the MUTCD is that federal and state funding is sometimes held against us as a way in which if we're not in compliance, then state and federal funding can be withheld. And then the litigation is the other kind of key issue that sometimes cause engineers pause. So we have to think about this in terms of if we have the standards and guidance, is it actually leading to the safest street network that we can build? And I think the answer, like I said before, from a ped bike perspective, is the answer is no, that it hasn't led to a safe systems. If we just compare the US practice with practice in the Netherlands, you can clearly come to the conclusion that we could do better as an engineering profession with safety. And I'll just pick on the one topic that I feel is near and dear to my heart is pedestrian signals. And the manual says that you shall take into consideration the needs of pedestrian as well as vehicular traffic. But then it goes on in the next section, and here's the full text. I'm going to expect you to read that. My next slide actually calls out the text in question that's objectionable from an APBP member perspective, where it says the design and operation of traffic signals shall take into consideration the needs of pedestrians, but pedestrian signal heads are not required. Now, if you're trying to cross the street and all you know is that it's green, you don't have the information of a flashing don't walk to guide you on whether it's close to being the end of the movement, and you don't have the benefit of a countdown timer. So this is an issue where we know there's a strict safety benefit of having a pedestrian signal head, but the MUTCD hasn't been willing to recommend that practitioners shall require signal heads when you have a pedestrian crossing. And I find that objectionable. I believe that that should be a requirement of any traffic signal. So here's your quiz. I thought, just to wake you up a little bit. I know we're all near to celebrating our pandemic anniversary. So hopefully a quiz will get you excited about being involved in this webinar. Should, shall, or may? What is the pedestrian signal requirement? And again, the answer is it's a should. It's only a should. And so that's the sort of advocacy that we're doing at the national level, is trying to move towards what we believe is a safer system by requiring some of these things, being more explicit about what the Federal Highway Administration is going to require at traffic signals. So this is in the new documentation, still a should. We'd like it to be a shall. And so that's a comment that you could make as a part of this process if you agree with the APBP policy and agree with me on this particular topic. Another topic that's near and dear to my heart is bicycle signals. And Peter First's most recent post on the APBP community on this topic, and the example that he cited near his home is a great example where if the interim approvals and documentation are not written correctly, engineers may be left to use their own discretion. And in some cases, that discretion may not take the form of the best practice for ped and bike facilities. We can obviously have more conversation about that. That's a whole webinar in itself. What's new in the manual? There's a lot of new things in the manual. The MUTCD has incorporated bicycle boxes, bike lanes through intersections, buffered bike lanes, contraflow bike lanes, and you'll hear a little bit more about that from all the other speakers today. I think the key issue that I want to raise with Chapter 9 is that it also highlights that there are a lot of shall conditions. So it dictates what practicing traffic engineers will have to do with all of these various aspects. And so that's of concern for us as we think about, can that hinder their applications throughout practice? If you think about this from where we want to get to, and Vision Zero is clearly, and safer streets is clearly an objective of APBP members, you know, speed limits and signal warrants are also topics that are worth looking into. And so as you think about your role a little bit, I'm looking forward to sharing this stage with Tom, and going to pass this on to Tom to talk a little bit more about specifics about how to get involved. So with that, I'll just say thank you for letting me serve APBP, and tell Tom to take it away. Tom, are you on mute?
To unmute. Okay, there it is. Sorry. It said the organizer had to unmute me. I wasn't able to unmute myself. That's helpful. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. All right, let me know if you can see my screen. You can see my screen okay? All right, thumbs up. All right, everybody. So how do we actually read this document and submit comments? Peter did a really good job of explaining the why. He gave a context. He went over a lot of the different chapters. He explained some of the issues we're having. But what about the nitty gritty? How do we actually read the proposed MUTCD? How do we submit comments, make our voices heard? I'm going to talk about that a little bit and then delve into a little more of the comments as well. When you pull up this website of the FHWA, the Federal Register website, it's a lot of text. You know, we're used to these really user-friendly websites, and you see a lot of text. Now I'm going to sort of demystify this a little bit and explain how to go through this. There's really only a couple sections, a couple areas that you really need to focus on. So you can see the text on the left of the screen. This is what the federal portal looks like. And if you want to submit a comment, there's actually a couple places to do it. You can see in red on the right, in green, you can click that submit a formal comment button. On the left, there's another button you can click to submit a comment. And there's a YouTube video on this. It's 2021, and you go to YouTube for almost everything, it seems. And this is no exception. This is what the YouTube video looks like. I actually blew up the bottom left just so you can read it better. You can see this just was created a month ago. It has 300 subscribers and 2,000 views. So you can be among the first subscribers. I do recommend this video to go through to kind of demystify the process a little further. And here you can see where I have number 1 and number 2 on the right side. Those are the two areas I really think you should focus on. Those little icons on the left where it says discussion, submit comment, read comments, as you scroll down, those will stay there. The discussion, the very first icon, is great because if you want to know what was changed in the bicycle, pedestrian, all these other areas of the manual, you can read the discussion. It really gives you a nice breakdown of it. So I definitely recommend reading that. The second button you can submit comments, and the third button you can read comments. You can see there's already 197 comments you can read through. Now the most important is where it says corrected MUTCD proposed text in the bottom right, number 2. You definitely want to click on that button, download. I recommend downloading both what's called the clean version and the marked up version. The clean version was approved by the MUTCD and sent to FHWA. The marked up version is what the FHWA sent back to us. Now I will mention this was quite a process just to get it approved by the NCTCD, which I'll call the National Committee, because so Peter and I sit on the Bicycle Technical Committee, and we spend a lot of time. I mean, I was the chair of the advisory bike lane proposal, and I spent 2 years just getting that proposal through the Bicycle Technical Committee, and I'm now currently in the process of getting it through the other committees. So there's a lot of effort that goes into these. So we get it through our committee, then it has to go through other committees like the Markings Committee and the Signals Committee. Then it goes to the full National Committee before it gets to the FHWA. So, and then the FHWA sometimes says, oh, you know, all that work, we're gonna change that. So there's a lot of work that goes into this. This is why it's nice to look at both these committees. Now, once you open up this PDF, there's a lot in there. I really recommend just hitting a little search. You can search for bicycle, pedestrian. Peter talked about shall, should, may. You can search for shall. Shall is the most important word in that document because we're required, besides if there's engineering judgment, to do that. So this is a really helpful tip. Peter touched a little bit on all the chapters. You can read this later. Melanie is going to send this to all the participants. But if you really want to focus on a few chapters first, you can focus on the bold chapters. The speed limits is a really important issue that Matthew's going to talk about later. Peter mentioned ped heads and how it's a should and how we prefer it to be a shall. Also in the signals chapter, bike signals are not allowed with hawk signals. They do exist in Arizona, but they're currently not allowed. This is another big issue for us. The school zones chapter is important. And of course, chapter 9, bicycle chapter is important. I will point out that here's 9 chapters and there's no pedestrian chapter. You can see chapter 5 is autonomous vehicles. That was a bit of a surprise. We didn't have that before. It's almost like in the school lunch line when that kid kind of cuts in front of you. That's how it felt to a lot of us when the AV chapter got put in. When we've been talking about adding a pedestrian chapter for a long time, and we said, whoa, where did this AV section come from? So these are some of the issues we're working through. So, you know, we have an unprecedented number of changes in the bicycle-related chapter. You can imagine in the last 10 years, 12 years, there's been so many changes for bike facilities and bike-friendly communities. These are, you know, Peter already touched on a lot of these, but you can go ahead and comment on separated bike lanes and roundabouts. One of my personal favorite items in there is contraflow bike lane. We definitely want more comments from all of you on this. There's a lack of guidance on a national level for contraflow bike lane, so that's a very important one. This proposed detector marking symbol, and I talked about advisory bike lanes. Peter Kunst worked on this for a long time. It was such a victory to get it approved by the National Council, and then it got taken out by the FHWA. I hope people comment on this. And of course, there's other chapters. Now, pedestrian facilities. We've had a significant rise in fatalities for pedestrians over the last decade, as all of us know, of course. However, pedestrian-related chapters remain relatively unchanged. And as I mentioned, there's no chapter on pedestrians in the MUTCD, even though we're working on that. You can do a search for pedestrian. There's over 1,000 mentions of it. And there's a lot of sections to focus on, you know, focus on traffic signals, focus on pedestrian crossings, on crosswalks. And Gwen and Matthew are going to talk about this more later chapters. Finally, I've gotten personally a bunch of questions on advisory bike lanes. Tom, is this going to be in the new MUTCD? Unfortunately, it's not. A group of us, I think there were about 18 of us on the task force. I was the chair of the task force. It's been a couple years. We finally, in January, got it approved by the Bicycle Technical Committee. We sent it out to the Marketing Technical Committee. They're looking at it. It still has to go to the full committee, but there's a ways to go. You can see on the right, there's a long process for the amendment process. And at this point, no new information is going to make it into this next edition of the manual. That is a very important distinction because a lot of people are trying to get new information in there. At the moment, we're just commenting on existing information. And there's plenty to comment on. I think Peter mentioned it, I've mentioned it, and next Wen and Matthew are going to mention it. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Wen, who's going to pass it on to Matthew. There you go.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. How's my audio? Good, great. So Peter and Tom, thanks for framing kind of where we are and what the MUTCD is, what the NCTCD does, what APBP's role is, and some of what's in and what's not in the manual as proposed by FHWA. I'm going to talk about a little more about that, what's in, what's out. So a really quick summary is that automated vehicles get their own part, their own kind of mega chapter. There's a lot in there that is guiding cities and states toward widening lane markings, adding channelization markings, spending a lot of money on markings for automated vehicles. There's no mention of pedestrians in that chapter. And there's some material about bikes that might be a little bit alarming, including essentially an admission that machine vision is not capable of routinely detecting bicycles, and a recommendation that all bike lanes be physically separated or barrier separated. This is hard in some ways as language because it doesn't mean a protected bike lane. That's not exactly what that means. When you see you should do X in the manual, the problem with those should clauses is that they also can be pretty easily interpreted to mean you should not. So as that's currently written, there's a little bit of a risk that that the NPA could be interpreted as saying you shouldn't ever mark a buffered bike lane when an AV might be present. That's a really difficult recommendation to swallow. NACTO has developed a few key responses and positions on a few of the key issues that we've already seen, and I'm going to be sharing that. I'm not speaking for APBP, I'm speaking for NACTO, but it's important to recognize that that my daughter is here. Hey, Sophie. Hi.
Daddy, the plane is
Okay. We're gonna, Sophie. They do need more water. After that charming interruption, which reminds me of why this is important, the changes in the document really don't go far enough to proactively change speed limits in the analysis of the NACTO membership and NACTO as an organization. There are some lingering issues with pedestrian and bicycle-related signal warrants, which Wen is going to be able to talk about more in crosswalk warrants. And there are some prohibitions, new prohibitions on things like crosswalk art. So, the rainbow crosswalks on the right would be prohibited. There are a few good things that are good to see in the manual. They're tools that were not in there before, but as I think Peter alluded to, some of them come with new restrictions that we didn't quite expect to be there. And I'll be able to talk about some of those now. Okay. Talking about bike lane markings, I think is just a good way. These are the bike intersection bike lane extension markings. Just a good way to highlight some of the tensions between where we are as an industry and where we are as practitioners and what's in the manual. Manual has come out and said, similar to what the interim approval said, it's not a surprise, but it's still a bit of a disappointment, that solid green bike lane extension markings are not allowed across an intersection, across a driveway. That's difficult because we're still in really the first decade or so of the use of green on a widespread basis. So it's a little preemptive to do that. But the good news is that bike lane extension markings, green colored pavement, is in the manual. A little bit of a weird conundrum is that the greenback sharrow is not permitted, even though it's much more conspicuous than a plain sharrow, especially where there are motor vehicles involved. Green-backed bike symbols are allowed on bike lanes, or sorry, on bike lanes and on protected bike lanes, separated bike lanes, but they're not allowed on trails. What's the difference? Well, that's a photo of something that's designated as a trail, but it looks an awful lot like a two-way protected bike lane to me in practice. There are certainly some trails that have pedestrian and bike sections separately, so let's keep going. So kind of just highlights the procedural issues. MUTCD is fundamentally written in a way that makes it a little bit ambiguous whether things that aren't explicitly permitted by the manual or described by the manual are allowed or not. But in general, there's been a hesitance to use specific devices that aren't in the manual. And for that reason, it's important to note that something that was approved by the National Committee, that's the sign on the right, it's made it into the MassDOT separated bike lane planning and design guide, and maybe even into some FHWA guidance, is still considered experimental by FHWA. You're allowed to use it if you ask permission, or you can do it on your own and use documentation, and then hopefully submit data to FHWA later saying, hey, this site didn't have any crashes, or it had fewer crashes, or here's how it compared to the citywide average, or here's how it compared to other sites without this treatment. Useful sign, not in the manual, but we do have elk crossings and bears and two kinds of sheep. Possibly intentionally, possibly not intentionally, there's text that may prohibit or may make it difficult to justify using markings for an island, whether that's an island between two motor vehicle traffic lanes or between a bike lane and a motor vehicle traffic lane. The manual appears to suggest that island would have to be painted entirely white to be compliant. That's challenging because we know that cities like to use specific colors consistently for pedestrians. I'm going to go quickly. Maybe you want to, yeah, okay, great. Many of you know about the rainbow crosswalk issue. Apologies, nobody else here. When you can go ahead to your slides. Thanks, I'll be right back.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think right here is a really prime example of what we have in every city. Everybody, we're striving. We may use brick crosswalk, which is also a maintenance issue, if you're talking about cities, and that's the requirement. But rainbow crosswalk and painted intersections and all these facilities are not permitted. So as you can see, there's like new rules that allows the may in the purple dash lane and the easy pass pull only. But if you want to look at bus only lanes or typically what we call red carpet, it's may with an engineering study. But yet some facilities shall not. So there's a lot of conflicting rules within the new docket itself. And of course, we had probably a 2-hour discussion on what we should consider as far as flashback signs within our meetings. But as far as speed limit signs itself, it's limited to what we're allowed to do. So more about NACTO itself and the policies. This information is linked right here. So when this presentation is over, you're more than welcome to take a look at this document to see what are the priorities. That was Matthew's section. I'm sorry if I didn't do it properly.
I'm sure you did a great job.
Thank you. More about myself. I feel like I've dedicated quite a lot of time lately to committeeing, and enjoy it because this is where we can really, influence change. And one thing I wanted to emphasize is the committee needs more membership. I serve not only as the MUTCD, but I also serve on the markings committee, and we always welcome new members. But prior to this, I was the city traffic engineer for the city of West Palm Beach. So not every little girl dream of growing up to be a traffic engineer, but here I am trying to figure out what's the best thing to do for the communities that I served. I've done quite a bit of daring, I guess, designs that does not or was not supported by the MUTCD itself. Whether if it's a painted crosswalk, painted intersection, this is a protected roundabout for bikes. I see Peter is looking at it. This was not in the manual when we designed it, but because of these types of designs that actually influence and affect change, right? And so what I want to say is that, a lot of time I have to engineer or exercise my engineering judgment. And it's really easy not to do anything. It's easy not to implement any change. But then when we look into our communities itself, we see that there's crashes everywhere we look. We know where the hot spots are at, and we know where the crashes are turning up, right? They're major arterial roads. That's typically the county and the state roads itself. And you probably get really frustrated because not a lot of changes happen on state and county roads. A lot of these really good implementation and really good changes are actually on city streets. But in the city of West Palm Beach, when we dig into the data, and we try and see what's the root cause of a lot of these issues, and it's really just crossings in general. So nearly 80% of pedestrian-related crashes in the city of West Palm Beach did not occur at an intersection, right? So that's very alarming. But when we look into guides and manuals, and there are so much resources and references out there. There's a very specific one that cites guides for improving pedestrian safety at uncontrolled crossing locations. Very, very specific. And even though there's a list of menu on how to provide solutions, it all points to crossings, right? And crossings follow under the warrant chapter. And so what I want to say is that there are communities all over the U.S. that defies these rules and have done an amazing job at providing the appropriate facilities. At the highest level, the MUTCD is very car focused. It favors car capacity and convenience over safety by itself and pedestrian convenience. It really is a crisis, as Tom mentioned earlier. Increasingly, pedestrian crashes have been going up, and crossings just like this one are not supported, right? Because it's considered unwarranted. So it's considered an unwarranted signal. And so if you practice and you go into the chapter 4, the traffic signals section, it's quite complicated. And one of which is how much pedestrian access do you have to justify just so that you can provide a signal itself. So signal warrants are really being a recommendation to consider rather than the requirement for consider. The warrant system itself is really based solely on the use of traffic signals to speed traffic, making it easier for cars to move quickly through our streets, our corridors. So really, where do we begin? So I just want to focus everybody on how important it is to comment on this docket as a takeaway. Is that, if you want to focus on mid-block crossing, you have to identify the need, right? And this is something that everybody can relate on. This is what your commissioners, your council, your mayor, everybody is asking for. You ask an average person, and maybe it's Peter's daughter, right? It's they're all thinking the same thing. How can I cross the street safely? And so, as practitioner, we just want it to be easy and transparent for us to make these rules and make these changes on the city streets. So a little bit of chapter 4, and I think Peter and Tom mentioned it earlier. If you read carefully, pedestrian heads are not mandatory, right? for traffic signals, and bike signals are not allowed within the pedestrian highway. So it's a shall not clause. And maybe somebody can help me understand. I don't want the reason behind it. Maybe we're not designing for complete street. I think what that is that this is the status quo, right? Which is for car capacity and not exactly for improving pedestrian safety. And so I know that there's a new chapter and someone cuts in line, and that's a great example. But regardless if there's an AV chapter or there's other technology advancements, like we've been walking for the past 100 years. And so we're going to continue to walk for another decade. So we should really be designing for that. And here's an opportunity for everyone who participates to really comment, please send a letter. And the deadline is on May 14th. And I think right now, I believe Peter may make a better case on, please, make your comments. And I'm going to pass it back to Peter.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Wait, I think hopefully we've made the case to you that we need your help with this, and this is the wrap up. So it's my call to action. So just check to see you're seeing my slides just to make sure. Yes. Okay, great. So in the slides, I posted this in the APB community. This orange box, you can't miss it. If you click on that, you will find some sample comments. And so it's a Google Drive link that's open. So if you don't have comments yet and you want to pre-populate comments and look at what I've done, feel free to jump on that. Look at that. You're already halfway there to write a nice summary of what needs to change. But honestly, the schedule is as it is. So you're here today. Thank you for being here. It's March 10th. If you didn't remember, like my kids say, that we forget what day it is in the pandemic. So we've got about a little over 2 months. Okay, so this is where we're at today. You've learned a little bit about the MUTCD. Maybe you're already an expert. Maybe you're chomping at the bit to get comments in. March 24th, we have another webinar. We're going to have different voices in this topic to kind of walk you through the process, kind of link some of the APBP policies specifically to changes that these practitioners that'll present on March 24th will want to have. So that's exciting. So again, in the slides, that link there, if you click on that, it'll take you to that registration if you haven't registered already. So look at that. We're 2 weeks in and you're already ready to go. Month of April is the opportunity to review the Google Drive. And if you haven't already, continue discussing on the APB community so we can all get informed. I think the other part of this in April is to start that conversation with your local traffic engineer. As a city of Portland, the traditional way this has gone is we have commented, those comments have gone to the state DOT, and then the state DOT either discards them because they don't agree with them, and then they may never get into the docket. So this is where the action comes in. You have the ability to bypass your agency and to comment directly to the docket. The National Committee will ultimately see those, as will FHWA. So that's just a little pro tip. You can comment more than once. You could comment as part of your agency. Maybe at the month of April, you meet with your engineering colleagues. Maybe you bring them donuts. Maybe you send them a coffee. I don't know. Do whatever you have to do to convince them that your perspective on this is more valued because it fits the policies of your agency. And then eventually May 14th will come and you will have your comments submitted. So follow Tom's presentation and figure out how to get through that. So I think the role of APBP here is to try to walk you through this process. Hopefully we've given you some tools that will help you with this, some ideas of things that we're really struggling with or working towards making better. We could spend a bit more time in this webinar. We're going to leave that to the March 24th. Speed limits is one of my favorite topics. I think the question becomes, does the speed limits as written in the current manual, they have gotten a little bit better, incrementally better, but I would argue that they don't get to a safe systems approach. They do not match the goals of APBP. And that's really, I think, where we'd like to see the MUTCD get to. And the argument can be made that a safe citizen approach with an equity focus is really what this administration wants from the MUTCD. And as that link gets made stronger and by our comments, to really have it come from the top down and the bottom up. So with that, I'm looking forward to that March 24th webinar. I'm looking forward to more dialogue on the APBP community and looking forward to answering any questions you may have. So I'll bring back Melanie and see if there are any questions that have come in. And if you haven't jumped into the chat, I've been trying my best to answer them as I go, but now is a good time to ask those questions. And if we can get to a couple of those, I think that'd be great. I guess one question I'll start off for the panelists that are here while Melanie is looking through that is, this notion of how equity and diversity in that committee, I'll start off by saying, boy, that has not been a focus traditionally. It's been something that I've been asking about. It's something that I think the call from USDOT is coming. I think that if I could just give a quick shout out to Irene Marion, who's at USDOT now, left the city of Portland as the equity manager. Now, I think if she has half the impact she had on PBOT during her time at the city, we will be in much better shape from a diversity standpoint at the end of a 4 or 8 or 12-year time frame or whatever we see in this administration. So I'm excited about that. But I guess perspectives from you all, I'd welcome to see what specific things would make the diversity and equity of this national committee better.
The representation is pretty slim for anyone who's not white and male, and the professional representation is pretty slim also. I think that's something that's important to talk about, that as practitioners, we have jobs that are that involve explaining all of this to the public, representing this material in court. The NCUTCD doesn't have all that much legal or public outreach or communications professional experience to draw on, compared with the amount of its engineering, kind of, I'll call pure engineering experience. NACTO has taken a pretty clear stand that the National Committee has to get more diverse. 2 of our 3 voting delegates are women, and while we'd like to see more diversity on all of the delegations, we don't have control over them directly.
Great, thanks, Matthew. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think not only just the national delegation, but we need more participation in the actual the subcommittees. Whether it's, and I tend to think that people choose the most fun committees to work on, but it's committees like the marking committee that actually one of the more impactful changes, right? Because think of how much pavement marking goes down on the ground. And so definitely, because I serve on the marking committee, it's not represented as Matthew stated earlier. It is, I am probably one of 2 female minority that serves on that entire committee. So we definitely would like to see other participation, within a millennial age group, maybe that just has like a different perspective and that can help kind of balance the need, because I do think that a lot of the experience level that we have are traditional engineers that has been practiced, traffic engineer for historically for many years. Some of the comments that we even discussed in the subcommittee are not very practical. Like, for example, gore striping. One member said, we should that because it's dangerous to install at. But if you think about it from a constructability standpoint, there's different ways that you can do it, whether it's night work or lane closure, whatever that may be. It's the bottom line is it's needed, and I think we should advocate for new membership.
I think that's a challenge for us, is that we often, it's the most experienced people that, and we call it volunteering, but the reality is it's, most people are being paid. And if not, we should find ways to pay people that are going to be involved in this writing of the document. So that's clearly a step that we can take as we think about, if your agency, if you're able to get staff to jump into this, we'd love to have a more diverse participation within the National Committee.
Yeah, there's a dearth of engineers of color. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to say there is specifically a dearth of engineers of color on the National Committee.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Melanie, other questions that have come in?
We do have a couple other questions. One about e-scooter technologies and advancements in e-scooter technology and program adoption. The attendee is wondering if there's future MUTCD updates that are likely to include discussion around e-scooter related markings or signage.
I think the answer to that is there's no mention of e-scooters. It's all bicyclists. And that's an area, of course, that most cities are dealing with. It's just, it's been interesting, of course. Generally, we don't see change happening much in the MUTCD. But then, of course, autonomous vehicles came in, and we hadn't really seen that language presented. So the question becomes, gosh, shouldn't e-scooters and other sorts of devices be part of that as well? And should we spend more time on it? I was just on my bike commuting, and a one wheel came by at about. I couldn't be sure, but it seemed like a little bit faster than 20 miles an hour as they passed me. So it was a little bit like, oh gosh, something should be done about that. I wonder who could do something. That's definitely a step that we need to take.
All right, and we have a question about, would it be beneficial or more impactful if several municipalities in a region provide joint comments?
It's more impactful to have more comments from more people. I don't think that it is any more impactful to do one joint letter. I think the most important thing is to hear, for FHWA to hear really tangible examples and from your own jurisdictions, from your own experience, and of how the MUTCD process has hindered a specific project or delayed it or made it become watered down or influenced design decisions in an adverse way. I think that's very important. Unfortunately, I don't think you don't get points for trading notes, I guess. I don't know.
I think of it as for anybody who works in city government, like shown up to a commission meeting, right? When there's a line out the door and there's hundreds of people demanding the same thing, it makes it's more impactful that way. So in that, my personal opinion is we need like the quantity and quality of comments that comes that will help, implement some of these changes in the way that it makes sense.
Yeah, part of it is just showing. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
This is not a purely democratic process, so vote early and vote often.
That's right. You can make multiple comments. You can make a big picture comment now, and this, everything we know implies that the sooner the better, because these are big things for FHWA to think about. And then don't hold back if there's something very large and important now you want to say it now, say it politely but firmly, and ask for what you really want. And then, as time goes by, before the end of the deadline, submit those detailed line item comments. That pattern is exactly what every organization I've spoken to is doing.
And I would just recommend for anyone out there who's not really sure where to start, what to comment on, there's some great comments made by NACDO, by America Walks on their website. There's a really good blog post that I just tweeted out yesterday. It's several pages. You can read through that and then digest everyone else's comments and then come up with your own comments. You don't have to start from scratch. You can read through the comments that have already been made by these organizations and this blogger, and then submit your own comments. There's a lot of good comments out there.
Yep, all of our comments are online. The letter we sent to the Federal Register, as well as a memo outlining some of the issues that I described today.
Great. And we do have a couple questions coming in about how people can find out about opportunities to serve on committees or subcommittees. Is there a place that they should look for those opportunities?
I would recommend you contact Bill DeSantis, the chair of the Bicycle Technical Committee. All the chairs, you can find them on the MUTCD website. Just contact the chair of whichever committee you want to volunteer for. And even if you don't make it onto the committee, you're allowed to attend the meetings, which is something a lot of people don't realize. They think they have to be on the committee to attend these meetings, but they are open public. I'm sorry?
Well, I'll say, I mean, so Bill is the Bicycle Technical Committee, but that's one of our challenges. I think our Bicycle Technical Committee actually does a pretty good job. I think where we, and that's the strategy that we kind of encourage NACDO to use, and I've even considered it too, is, you may be more impactful in markings or signals or other where your voice, there's not a ped bike voice. That is part of the challenge that we have with the MUTCD is on temporary traffic control devices. There isn't somebody banging the drum saying, well, we started to bang the drum. I think we've been a little bit better doing a better job of coordinating and saying, on those drawings in the MUTCD, why don't you have bike lanes? That's the reality for many of us. Why shouldn't it be in a state, a federal manual, a state manual? So I think calling the question is part of our role is in moving us more towards drawings that come out of that guide that we can use. I mean, that's been the strength of NACDO, is creating guides that are the alternate to the traditional guides that have been created by ACTO. So thanks again to NACDO for starting this process and making sure that we have a little foil to the ACTO perspective.
Thanks to you, Peter, and Brent, for doing that work with me and others. Go ahead, Tom.
So I would echo Peter's comment. I would say that the Biotechnical Committee, we have so many good people on it. Some of the other committees are more important at the moment. The two in particular are the Signals Technical Committee and the Markings Technical Committee. Wynn is on the markings. Thank you for that. I know that when we finalized Advisory Bike Lane, aka Edge Lane Road proposal, we sent it to markings, and we've already received a lot of pushback. So I would love if we had more APBP members that would be a voice on that. The same with signals. Luckily, we have people like Peter Kunz and Rock Miller. They're doing amazing work on signals that have really pushed that needle. We still have a long ways to go. And I will say, Tony Hull actually just sent this message out. But for the pedestrian, there's no pedestrian committee, but there is a pedestrian task force. So Egan Foster from the city of Columbus, reach out to Egan to get involved with the pedestrian task force. In my presentation, I said it, but I'm just going to say it again. We have so much new information for bicycles in the proposed manual. We have almost no changes to the pedestrians. And that's where all the fatalities, the huge increase in fatalities, we really need voices for pedestrians. So please, please, please join the pedestrian task force and join one of the other committees and be a voice for pedestrians if you do nothing else.
So maybe I'll just add, if anybody is interested, you don't have to go to the technical chair. I'm happy to help orient you. So feel free to reach out via email. I mean, I think, especially if you have if you have a candidate that's a person of color, I mean, we need that diversity. It's part of the pipeline work we have to do to make sure that we get better representation. Because yes, our profession has been woefully inadequate to really represent our community that we're working in.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our presenters today. I do just have the final slide up as a reminder for the follow-up facilitated forum we'll have in 2 weeks from today. So be sure to register for that. If you haven't already, you can go to apbp.org and just visit the webinars page, and the information will be up at the top of the page. Thanks again to all of you for joining us. And we will be sharing the recording from today as well as the slides as some additional resources through the APBP community. So thanks so much, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Melanie. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Melanie.
Bye.